Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to an early morning. It's about 7 a.m., and we're going to go ahead and talk about Russia. Oh, my God. All right. Oh, God, that feels way better. All right, so we left off in class talking about Ivan the Grozny, also known as Ivan the Terrible, which actually, ironically enough, whenever you translate it from Russian into English, it doesn't mean terrible in the same kind of way we use the word terrible. It means kind of like bad. So it's kind of hard to explain, but like apparently Grozny doesn't carry the same kind of moral weight to it that the word terrible does to us, right? Funny enough, though, still really, really important. We kind of talked about why he was referred to as Ivan the Terrible, talked about some of his violent tendencies. We talked about how, like, he might have actually, like, you know, gone crazy from Mercury later in his life. Like, we talked about a lot of different stuff. But we did also talk about how he basically becomes the very first Tsar of Russia, and he also becomes the first, like, absolutist in a sense, right? So there was a lot of different stuff that I skipped over, too. Like, there's things that when you're talking about Ivan the Terrible, you can talk about for, like, days and days and days and days and days. The AP test is going to ask you everything about him. They're mainly going to ask you to understand and know the fact that his progression forward is going to be a really, really important thing. And then also, we talked about a lot of different things, like things we didn't talk about were like one time he like abdicated the throne to make the boyars beg him to come back and like all this other stuff. And then he said when he came back, he was like, I want to be an absolutist. It's like a crazy like story in and of itself. And one of the other crazy parts of the story is, of course, his wife. The very first one he was married to, his sons. We talked about that. What ends up happening to Ivan V, and which son is going to be left on the throne. But we do have a couple other things we have to talk about Ivan before we kind of leave Ivan and like move on to anywhere else, right? So the big thing, though, is that he does create an important absolutist institutions as far as becoming the Tsar, right? He creates the Russian standing professional army, which is a very, very important thing. So funny enough, he's doing all this stuff long before Louis ever even starts or gets even close to completing these actions, right? So he technically, you could argue, is the very first absolutist. Now, the other thing, though, is he organizes a Russian feudal system, right? He actually starts freeing a bunch of people that used to formerly be like slaves and starts creating them as serfs, and then Peter the Great, a later descendant, does it like wholesale. So then there's another big thing, too. He creates a Russian feudal parliament, right? So the Russian feudal parliament was a way to kind of create a legislative body to force these boyars to argue with each other to pass any kind of reparations or like ramifications or any kind of thing going forward, right? So any kind of laws or any kind of like declarations that would be coming out of this feudal parliament would actually be able to go through Ivan, be checked by him, and then eventually, basically though, in the long run, it was just a giant rubber stamp, right? Every time like Ivan wanted to do something, he would send it to this parliament, and they would just, yep, that's good, and then they would just like send it out, right? So the thing about it, it's like parlements, but with way more control from the king, right? So it's honestly kind of like the intendants for Louis, so in a sense. And that feudal parliament does have a name. It's called the Zemsky Sabor, right? So Zemsky Sabor is spelled Z-E-M-S-K-Y, and then S-O-B-O-R, okay? Zemsky Sabor, right? So we also talked a lot about like how the death of his wife changed everything. We talked about how he might have had paranoia or mental illness. We talked about St. Basil's and how he might have cut the tongue or burned the eyes out of the architect that built that thing. We also spent a brief time getting into this a little bit right here, right? We did tell the entire story, though, also about what happened to Ivan V, his son, and how he beat him to death with a scepter and stuff like that, which, funny enough, the scepter is right there, right? And you can actually see the pointed end of it where it ends up going into his noggin right there. And so, big thing, though, is even before the death of his son, he was very prominently known for executing like entire boyar families, right? So you have to understand that at the time, Russia was divided into two zones, right? There was the Novgorod zones, which were the things up in the north that were conquered territories, and then there was the Muscovy or Muscovite zones down in the lower end of the south where Moscow was located. So a big thing that he did, though, is he often got very, very paranoid, and he constantly thought that the boyars were going to unite against him to destroy him and actually try to assassinate him and stuff like that, much like they poisoned his mother to death when he was 8. So in a nutshell, though, what he does is he goes up there, because he's paranoid though, and he basically burns and pillages an entire city, kills entire groups of families, and then also gives land to new nobles that he just killed all the noble families, and he calls them service nobles, whose power is dependent on him, which is freaking genius when you think about it, even though he was pretty bad and he also killed a lot of people. So the other thing going forward, though, is that he then made so service nobles basically mirror the robe nobles in France, right? And then he also establishes this thing to keep those service nobles under his thumb, and then also a special squad to analyze and interpret the actions of other boyar families going forward to make sure that they are not going to step on his authority, right? He establishes two things. This thing called the Oprichniki and the Oprichniki, right? So Oprichniki is his secret police, right? So Oprichniki kind of begins this tradition in Russian history of Russian rulers having a secret police, right? No, sorry, Nicholas II had a secret police. Vladimir Putin had these people called Cheka, which were his secret police. So basically most Russian rulers have a secret police, right? They're these undercover agents and operatives that will go and abduct families or do the king's bidding or do whatever he tells them to do and brings them back in. For example, that was what happened in this story right here, where there was actually a newspaper writer because, funny enough, or an article writer that wrote an article about Ivan saying that he was doing like a bad job, right? It was a disparaging article. So Ivan had him brought in by the Oprichniki, and then he had him put in front of the Oprichniki, right? And the Oprichniki was two different things. One, it was an administrative zone in the north, but then also it was kind of this court and practice of accusing nobles of doing something wrong, or the boyars of doing something wrong, bringing them to justice, possibly having them executed, right? So as you can see right here, Ivan is actually down here on the floor screaming at the guy who wrote this article about him, but it looks a little weird because it looks right here like Ivan is actually sitting right here. These are Ivan's clothes. Ivan basically accused him of being like, oh, you think you're better than me? You think you can be czar? Why don't you give it a shot? And then he ends up stabbing him to death, right? So the Oprichniki is the court. The Oprichniki is the actual, the secret police that brings the people in, right? So big thing that's also going on, though, is a lot of people are starting to flee, right? So there's this weird group of people that Ivan had to deal with a lot, and they were called Cossacks, right? So the thing about it is, remember, Mongolians controlled Russia for more than 200 years, right? So they're not completely like Western in a sense. A lot of people that lived out in the Eastern territories practiced much more of an Eastern style way of life. Agricultural, kind of much more like warlike and a little bit more primitive. These people were sometimes referred to as Cossacks. A lot of people call them land pirates sometimes, right? They're kind of like these mercenary wild men that live out in the east, and serfs begin to try and flee their feudal situations and start trying to run out there, right? For example, there is a picture of a Cossack right there. So the thing about it is that Ivan forced a new standard because of this, to stop serfs from fleeing out there, so we'd have to stop fighting these wars with Cossacks. The thing he actually creates is that serfs are now also going to be servants to the Tsar, so fleeing would result in death. He fought several large wars as well, also not only some small battles against Cossacks, but he also fought several large wars against this kingdom called Polish-Lithuania, because Polish-Lithuania was losing a lot of money and territory, so he was trying to be kind of on top of things or whatever. But then what ends up happening a little bit later on is Ivan does die, right? And since Ivan dies with only one son left on the throne goes to Fedor. Look at him. So Fedor, poor Fedor, we don't really know what was wrong with him. A lot of people think that he might have actually had possibly a learning disability and things like that, or an antisocial personality disorder, because he would just spend hours upon hours upon hours in his room all the time, praying and praying and praying. And he also loved to go to different churches and see the architecture and stuff. That was one of his favorite things to do whenever he wasn't in his room praying. And apparently that's where he got a nickname called Fedor the Bell Ringer, right? Because he was so pious. Well, the problem was that Fedor got married and then never had any kids. So when he died, there was no more people left on the throne, and his family's now dead. You need to write down Ivan the Terrible, Fedor's family name really quick. They're called the Rurikids, right? So Rurikids, okay? The Rurikids, right? So the Rurikids were the very first czarist family of Russia. And so now we've got a secession crisis. And over about the span of 12 years, about over 10 years, when he dies, the infrastructure is going to collapse, leading to this thing known as the time of troubles. And in this sense, in this power struggle, in this chaos, where they're trying to figure out who's going to be our king, who's ruling the army, and the boyars start fighting over who's going to be in charge and all this other crazy stuff, Poland actually invaded Russia and caused major damage and won won several large battles and pretty much won a small war, which is pretty wild when you think about it, because Polish-Lithuania never won wars really, and they also were just super fractured. They had this really weird system of trying to elect kings and stuff, where they used a parliament to like pick somebody all the time. It was a very weird thing. But the big thing, though, Gregory Orlov, actually the boyfriend of Catherine the Great, becomes king of Polish Lithuania at one point. Now, going into it, though, that time of troubles follows the death of Fedor because there was no one there to take the throne, right? Well, the person who does end up taking the throne is this guy, Mikhail Romanov, right? Or Mikhail Romanov, okay? He will be elected as the new Tsar because he is Ivan's grandnephew, okay? Now, in a sense, it's because his aunt, his direct blood aunt, was Anastasia Romanova. That's right. So now we're seeing the ascension of the Romanov family. Mikhail Romanov comes into power. He is the first Romanov to come into power completely, and he is going to be the one who tries to grow and expand the empire past the Ukraine and all the way to the Black Sea, as well as his family. Now, the Romanov family is going to rule from 1613 to 1917. That's right. We're talking about one family being in charge of Russia for 300 years. That is insane. Now, you know a lot of famous Romanovs. You know Anastasia, you know Alexei, and you've probably heard of Nicholas II. You've probably heard of the Tsarina, and like we'll talk about Rasputin a little bit later. But that's all in the era of 1917. There's one other super, super famous Romanov that is super important to the growth of Russia, and he basically creates Russia as a European state rather than being Eastern state. Because look at this real quick. That right there, that's Mikhail Romanov. Look at his dress. Look at his face. Look at, not his dress. It's not a dress. It's a robe, actually. It's what the boyars are very famous for wearing. But look at the clothes he's wearing. Look at the setting he's sitting in. Look at all the things around him. This right here is what you would consider super old school Russian, right? Or Muscovite, like in dress. Look at Ivan the Terrible, Muscovite in dress, right? Very old traditional Russian stuff. Look at the Cossack, Muscovite in dress. Look at Fedor right here, Muscovite style dress. You've got all these things that are traditionally the Russian, but then look at this guy, Peter the Great. Looks completely different, right? So Peter the Great looks much more what you would consider like a Western European during this time period, right? We're getting into the 1700s now. We're actually right now probably right around 1698 because I believe that's when Peter the Great came into power. It was about either 1698 or about like 1696. Now, like, so the big thing about it though is Peter the Great is a Romanov. Peter the Great is going to be the one who rules from 1682, there we go, 1682 to 1725, okay? So he's going to rule 10 years past Louis XIV, and he's going to have a major impact on the progression of European history. He is basically like Louis XIV in Russia, but nicer and a little bit more chill, all right? So, like now, well, except for one thing, but we'll talk about that later. Now, but are they Eastern still? A little bit. Thing about it is, not after Peter the Great, right? So Peter the Great is going to create the Western version of Russia. Even though he had a tough upbringing, right? Like when he was young, his mother died and his sister Sophie had to rule for him, and mainly because like him and his older brother like ended up having to be co-rulers together. His older brother's name was Ivan. He was about like 9, he was about like 11 or 12, and I think Peter the Great was about like 9, and they actually had to sit on the throne together and rule together because they were both too young, and like their mom and their sister used to have this little hole behind them in the chair and be like, hey, tell them that we're gonna do this, and they'd be like, we're gonna do this, like, so like they would actually legit like have their mom speaking to them through a hole in the back of a chair so they could hear it, right? So in the essence of the whole thing though, Peter the Great does eventually ascend the throne, and he starts ruling all of Russia officially as their Tsar as of about 1690, I think it's about 1698, 1697, right? But that's when he's on his own, okay? So before that, from 1682 to about 1695, he's actually ruling with his brother, right? He's actually, because he's just too young. Now, the thing about it is, though, big thing very similar to Louis XIV, only 1 year out of his reign was peaceful, right? He grew a massive Russian army and also grew a massive amount of Russian territory. So underneath him, that's when you leave the idea of Muscovy behind, and actually after Peter the Great, go ahead and jot this down, Russia will be known as the Russian Empire, right? Because they start controlling other people and more people that are not necessarily Russian, right? So going into it though, whenever he was about to start his rule, he went on this amazing thing that changed the dynamic and progression of Russian history forever, right? So like it was called his Grand Embassy or his Grand Tour, right? So you can call it either one, but put both, put Grand Embassy / Grand Tour. It's when Peter the Great and a group of advisors, a group of his noble advisors, 200 of them, went on a year-and-a-half long tour of Western Europe. They bounced around all these different countries, and they were checking out everything, right? They went to France to see diplomacy. They went to England to see military science. They went to the Dutch Republic to see how they built boats and stuff like that. They went to all these different countries, really learning from the best and the brightest throughout all of Europe. And a big thing you need to understand, jot it down underneath this, is what's going on in the 1700s and during Louis's reign is this era known as the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment became a huge movement that's going to be going on, going from about like 1715, you could argue, is when it starts, all the way up until probably you could argue mid-1800s, right? So if you want to like really have the argument. Now the thing about it though is like, don't worry McKenna, we are going to talk about Voltaire, who is one of my favorite French philosophers, and René Descartes, who is also one of my favorite French philosophers. But the big thing about it though is that in this essence and understanding, he is going around and he is seeing and witnessing the fact that Russia is like 300 years behind in technology, right? They don't have boats like the Dutch do. They don't have military technology like the English do. They don't have diplomatic processes like Louis does over in France, right? So he studies the crafts, the weaponries, the naval fleets of all these different things. Oh, and by the way, he did this completely in disguise, right? Most of the time he was in disguise, but everybody was pretty sure it was him because, he was 6'7", 6'8". The average height of most European men during this time period was actually that of about 5'5", okay? So, and this dude towered over all of them. He was 6'8". He was huge. Actually, when we go to Europe, I'm going to be reading his biography. That's my plan for the Europe trip because it's a very, very big one. So now, but the big thing though going into it is he was blown away. Even though he was in disguise, he was still blown away by the power brought by trade, by the Dutch and the English East India companies. He was just mind blown by the idea of how much you can do when you can trade, when you have a navy, and also when you have a sophisticated military, right? So Peter the Great then creates the new version of Russia. Moments after he comes back, because it was actually this big thing, this big group of people called the Streltsy actually had a rebellion against him. The Streltsy are like this group of nobles that you don't need to worry about. So whenever he comes back to Russia, though, to suppress this entire thing, because he actually had to leave his Grand Embassy early. He was planning on that, like staying on it for even longer, but then he had to return back to Russia to put down this rebellion, right? But when he does come back to Russia, he passes a wide range of new reforms, right? So go ahead and jot some of these reforms down. One of the biggest ones is he made it so if you wanted to talk to him about anything diplomatic, you had to actually speak to him in French, right? Because the French was the language of diplomacy of the era. If you were talking about governmental politics from one country to another, English kings spoke French, mainly due to the fact that France was the most populated country at the time. They were also one of the most powerful countries at the time, right? But if you wanted to talk diplomatic stuff or government things, you spoke French to that man, right? So that was a big thing. He also forced a lot of his nobles and advisors to wear Western style clothing that you can actually see him wearing right there. He opened up new academies of sciences and new schools. He pushed that all nobles need to be educated. He also lifted some rights on women. Women actually before Peter the Great had to wear veils in Russia anytime they went outside. And he said, no longer do you need to do that. You can have your face uncovered and things like that. And then theoretically, if you do want to wear a veil, you need to be married, right? So and then another big one is he introduces a book of Russian manners about how you should eat at the table like Western Europeans do. Not that Russians were eating off the ground at the time, but how you should actually have a formal party. And then another big one is, look what's not on his face that's on every other Russian's face. A beard. He outlawed beards. He literally outlawed beards. Now, you could have a beard, but you would have to pay a beard tax, right? So if you were coming in to Moscow to talk to him or to see him or discuss with him or advise him, you either shave that beard off, which he had men standing at the gates of the palace with razors and a chair to shave the beard off nobles, or you had to pay a beard tax, right? So that's a really, really big one as well. So the going into it, though, you have to understand, remember what he's all about. He was blown away by the triumph and the power and the amazing growth of the East India companies of both Dutch and English, right? And so he decides that my mission in existence right now is to create warm water ports.
Louis Le Grand, you can call me Sun King. Peter the Great, Russian Tsar, might have heard of me. Warm water port, yeah, that's what I want to see. European tour, going west, want to come with me? I'd rather die than have a noble running me. Shave that beard, show me them lips. Better grab a hammer, cause I'm building ships. Sail them down to Azov for a campaign. Turks couldn't hold the place after I came. I got a warm water port, ruling absolutely. Wear French fashions in my court, ruling absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So that video right there, if you see Angelina Murphy, tell her that I put it down in the description. But that is Tom Ritchie's rap about Louis XIV and Peter the Great. And it's all about warm water ports, right? It's all about warm water ports. I'll actually put the video down in the description. Now, the big thing, though, going into it, it's all about warm water ports. Everybody needs warm water ports, right? So you cannot be able to trade and make money without warm water ports, right? Warm water ports just means that at no point during the year does it freeze over completely to prevent the movement of boats both in and out. Now, the first place that he eyeballs to try and create this warm water port is actually down towards the Ottomans. So if you look at a map of Russia, and we'll look at it in class as well. When you look at a map of Russia, the Ottomans are directly to the south of the Russian, the growing area of the kingdom of the Russites and the Russians, right? So down below them is the Ottomans. So Peter the Great invaded the Ottoman Empire for one particular reason, to create a port known as the port of Azov, right? And that port is actually on the borders of the northern ridge of the Black Sea. So he was thinking to himself, oh, I can get to the Black Sea, I can then go out through the Strait of the Dardanelles, and then trade in the Mediterranean, right? Well, the thing about it is he was happy with this port. He thought it was okay. But the one that he really wanted access to was that of the Baltic Sea, right? So there is a huge area in the northern area of Europe known as the Baltic Sea, right? And the Baltic Sea goes around Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, England. And it also goes to the Dutch Republic. So when you think about this, or when you're thinking about this in particular, he wanted the Baltic Sea way more than he ever wanted the port of Azov, right? He wanted a Baltic Sea port because then he could actually trade with the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, right? Those two groups that are going through these massive economic golden ages. So what he wants to do is he wants to take some of that land. Problem is, it belongs to a very strong and powerful kingdom, that known as Sweden, right? So he had a massive war against Sweden known as the Great Northern War, right? And the Great Northern War, this war is going to be a pivotal moment in European history because maybe Russia would not be a dominant power and maybe Sweden would have actually been a dominant power. Could Sweden have won this war, right? Now, early on, I know some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, it says right here, Russia failed. Well, early on they did, right? Early on, Peter the Great's armies were embarrassed, right? Absolutely embarrassed. And this actually started, I think in 1701. All right, so I'm not positive, but I'll look it up. Now, the big thing about it, though, and I think it lasted about 1720. So the big thing is in the earliest years of the war, right, he was absolutely embarrassed. The Swedish had better firepower. The Swedish had better items. The Swedish had better military tactics. The Swedish had better navy, right? So all the while, Peter the Great's trying to build his navy, and he's trying to make one and stuff like that. But the thing about it is that he thought he was going to be able to do this so swiftly and easily because the king of Sweden, Charles XII, was only 15. Right? So he was super young. He was oh, they're going to be weak, right? But what ends up going down is Peter realizes that he must restructure and become even more Western than he thought he had to be, right? So he passes even more reforms, right? He now says that nobles, boyars, are all now civil servants, much like a legislative branch, right? You either serve your king or you serve no one. We understand each other, right? You are now a servant to the government, right? So he also requires that all nobles who are going to work as his advisors are also required to go on a tour of Europe like he did, right? You're going to go bounce around Europe and you're going to learn some stuff for about 5 more years. He then expanded all of these new schools and he opened the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is a big deal. Jot that down, Russian Academy of Sciences. Because Louis opened the Paris Academy of Sciences. So as we can see right now, absolutists support sciences, right? Paris Academy of Sciences, Russian Academy of Sciences. Sciences is very important. He also did that because when the nobles would return, he expected them to keep learning, right? Become more educated, become smarter. He also created a common man army of 200,000 people. And he made the boyars their officers, right? So he is integrating his power in with the noble power, but he's making noble power dependent upon him, right? Because he would be the ultimate commander of the entire military. Now, he came back after these reforms, and he crushed the Swedish to gain access to the Baltic Sea. And when he did that, he created his new warm water port city of St. Petersburg, right? Ironically enough, named after St. Peter, St. Peter's Basilica, right? Not actually named after himself, even though I argue that he probably actually was named after himself, but whatever. So the thing about it is that he builds the new capital there after this victory. And if you're looking at St. Petersburg, it is so very, very Western. Look at the beautiful streets, the uniform height of the buildings. This right here is actually going to be his version of Versailles. It's known as the Winter Palace. It's actually built inside of in St. Petersburg, and the construction of it began underneath Peter the Great in about 1711. And you can see actually the road maps right here. It is a Western style city, right? So, and this is the area of which it would take up, and this is its new warm water port right here on the Baltic Sea, right? So the thing going forward though is he makes even more reforms right after this, and one of the biggest ones he does is he creates this thing known as the table of ranks, right? He did a lot of other stuff too. He actually simplified the Russian alphabet. He switched to the Julian calendar, the one that the rest of Europe was using, because actually before Peter the Great, the calendar was all screwed up and it was a Russian one, and they thought it was the year 14 something, and that was actually the year 17 something. So he is going to be the one that actually gets on the same time system that the rest of Europe is going to be using. And this table of ranks was a really big deal because it changed dynamically the way that nobles progressed their power, right? He made their rank based on their service to the king rather than their birthright, right? So he basically is going to be the first absolutist to create a merit system, right? So basically saying the harder you work for me, the better off you are, the more sophisticated you will become, right? And many boyars hated all these changes, right? A lot of people did not like Peter the Great, you have to understand. For example, one of the people that didn't like him was actually his son, right? His son Alexis, and his son Alexis actually ran away during the Great Northern War because he was going to be like, hey, son, why don't you come and help me defeat the Swedish in battle? It'll be a good time, right? And then Alexis is like, no, and then he runs away to Europe, and then at one point he starts talking crap about his dad and how he can't wait for him to die and he's going to take over and do better. And then so Peter the Great brought him back. He's like, I heard you're trying to inspire a rebellion against me. And so he then takes his son and puts him in the basement of the Winter Palace and has him tortured to death, his own child. So he's not he's the best guy on the planet. And he would actually die later on of a bladder infection. I'll talk about that part about the story a little bit later on. But many boyars hated all these changes. But westernization means more power for Russia, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit more, and we will actually finish up and start talking about the Hohenzollern reign in Prussia, several other things. But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.